step aside. You're just a test technician." The jeer cracked through the command center, laughter spilling as the countdown blared. Mira Kalen's jaw tightened, eyes locked on the flashing red warning only she seemed to notice. Guards rushed in, seizing her arms, dragging her back as the numbers plunged. 10, 9, she tore free, slammed her palm against the console, and outside the glass the missile roared skyward, fire splitting the desert horizon. The room froze, mouths wide, eyes blown open in disbelief, but then came the silence, broken by one voice. Colonel Aldrich Briggs stepped forward, gaze fixed on the steel glint at Mira's collar. His voice trembled. "That badge? It shouldn't exist. What secret could that forbidden insignia possibly reveal?" This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. Granite flats shimmered under noon heat, a pale sheet of concrete and sand framed by antenna spires and blocky hangars. Heat rippled off the launch apron until the distant gantry looked like it floated. Inside the command room, the air smelled of baked dust and warm circuitry, fans. Hummed over rows of consoles, each with its small forest of status lights. People talked too loudly, as if volume could banish nerves. Somewhere a coffee cup clinked, hollow in the buzz. Mira Kalen stood at the guidance station with her sleeves rolled too. The elbows, hair twisted into a quick knot that kept sliding loose. A tool roll sat neatly to one side, a stack of dog-eared procedures to the other. On her screen, the guidance health panel traced patient green lines, gyros, accelerometers, star tracker, GPS assist, 4 steady lanes of all good. She didn't watch the green. She watched what sat between the lines. "Hey, technician!" A lieutenant with a clipped grin called from behind the telemetry rack. "Don't touch anything unless someone with rank says so." His friend smiled without looking at her. Mira didn't answer. She feathered 2 keys and pulled the raw stream, unfiltered rate counts, timestamp deltas, checksum tags. A flicker arced across the numbers, so faint she almost blamed her eyes. She ran the packet again, slower. There it was, a micro stutter, a once every few hundred frames hiccup in the inertial loop. Too small to trip the green lanes, big enough, integrated over flight time, to bend the arc away from what the map called safe. The countdown display on the far wall blinked from a blank panel to a test sweep, then settled at T20. The room quieted, that false quiet of people trying to sound efficient. The test director, a square-shouldered major with sunburned ears, paced between rows and gave out times like a metronome. Pad is green, wins are inside envelope, guidance confirm, final align. Mira keyed the alignment once more. The algorithm's answer came back with the bland confidence of a machine. Nominal. She forced the view to jitter through a diagnostic roll and listened to the numbers sing back, or fail to. There, again, that tiny skip. She opened the filter design. Someone had updated the Kalman tuning coefficients overnight, squeezing response by a hair. On a perfect sensor, that would be a boast. On a hot day over a vibrating desert, it was a dare. "Guidance?" the major prompted. She tapped the comm. "Request hold for anomaly review." Every head in a 10-foot circle pivoted like she'd spoken in a foreign language. The lieutenant gave a short laugh. A captain near the doorway lifted his phone just low enough to pretend. He wasn't holding it, camera lens peeking over his knuckles. The major didn't laugh. He pinched the bridge of his nose. Define anomaly. Intermittent phase lag in the inertial loop. It passes built-in limits, but the drift term under vibration could accumulate. Recommend rerun alignment with damped tuning and pad level shaker. Recommend. the lieutenant echoed. "We recommend keeping to schedule." The major kept his eyes on Mira. "Impact if we ignore it?" She tightened her jaw. She could feel all the faces waiting for her to flinch. "Worst case, guidance thinks we're more upright than we are. Midcourse tries to correct a wobble we don't have. We dump energy in the wrong direction. With this profile, the error could grow fast." "How fast?" "Fast enough to matter before we complete the arc." Silence pressed for a heartbeat. Then the major's gaze flicked to the timeline, already devouring seconds. "We're not rewriting filters at T18. He touched his headset. "Range, hold your questions. We'll proceed." The laughter came back, softer now, like a draft under a door. The captain with the phone angled it a fraction higher. The red recording dot ghosted across the glossy screen. Mira saw her own reflection in it for an instant, a woman with a smudge of thermal paste on her cheekbone and a look people mistake for meekness because it isn't loud. She brought up a black-on-white text console that most people in the room had never used, the one left over from older days when you spoke to the machine in its first language. She pulled a buffered window of gyro frames and laid them against the Axel stream. She did not blink. The skid was there, sly as a snake in brush. If the board cared more about theater than thresholds, it wasn't because physics would be impressed. "Ma'am," said a security NCO from the doorway, courteous voice wrapped around a warning. "We, LL, need you to keep your hands off control surfaces until the director calls your station." Mira nodded without looking up. She wasn't on the control surface. Not yet. She took her hands off the keys, let the graph scroll by itself, and lifted the handset to the internal circuit. "Guidance to director," she said, faster now, because polite had failed. "We need 1 minute for a damped alignment. It's a menu call, not a refit. If the filter clamps under pad vibration, we clear it here instead of chasing it at altitude." "T17, the major said, as if the numbers themselves were an argument. "Pad crew reports gantry retracting. All stations stay in lane." "Sir," Mira said, and in that one syllable burned the memory of the first time someone told her to stay in lane, and the last time she paid for stepping out. "If we light with that tuning, you're betting the desert is kinder than math." The lieutenant muttered something about drama. The captain's phone rose another inch. Out on the apron, the gantry arms crawled away from the slender white body of the test vehicle. The sun lit its skin until it seemed more sculpture than weapon. A heat shimmer slid across the glass in front of the command room and turned the rocket into a mirage. Telemetry chimed, GPS assist locked. The star tracker reported catalog ready. The green lanes smiled their fixed smile. Mira opened the pad vibration feed and injected a test pulse. It was not a proper shaker, not at this late hour, but it would tell her whether the bad note came from the song or the hall. The trace spiked, damped, rang once more, and there, right there, the inertial loop tripped its tiny delay like a child on a step. She could taste the copper of adrenaline. "Director, anomaly confirmed under simulated vibration. We are 1 toggle away from compensation." 1 minute only. The major's headset crackled with someone else's impatience. Range control, flight, safety. Perhaps a colonel in an air-conditioned office with an eye on budget. He didn't weigh her words long enough to honor them. Negative hold. Guidance, record your concern. We proceed. The room exhaled like a single lung. Keys clicked. Checklists marched. A Tech 2 aisles over whispered, "Here we go," and made a small sign over his heart that he thought nobody saw. Mira let the silence after the decision pass through her like a wave and leave her standing. She folded the handset back to its cradle. Her hands did not shake. The first page of her dog-eared procedures lay open where she'd left it this morning, over coffee that tasted like metal. Notes for situations where the instrument believes the world more than the world deserves. She had underlined the line about humility, the machines and the operators. The lieutenant leaned in as he walked by and spoke too close to her ear. "Don't worry. When this is done, we'll still need someone to wipe the fingerprints off the glass." He drifted away, smirking to his friends. Someone snorted. Someone else said, "Get her face. This'll be gold later." The phone lens waited like an insect eye. The red dot blinked. Mira rolled her chair an inch closer to the console and set the tips of her fingers on the rim of the keyboard without pressing. The pad vibrational feed still whispered. The loop still clicked its faint, treacherous click every few hundred frames. It would not show up for anyone who looked at the world in summaries. It would only punish the ones who believed the summaries. The wall display ticked to T10 and held for a final range check. The Major walked the room once more, counting off stations. Weather green, pad green, flight safety green, telemetry green, guidance recorded, Mira said, voice even. Anomaly remains, mitigation ready if ordered. "It won't be," the lieutenant murmured, too softly for the comms, loud enough for her. "We stick the landing, we roll footage, you learn your place." Through the glass, a dust devil spun itself thin and vanished. A raven cut a black line across the blinding sky and was gone. Somewhere under their feet, pumps spun propellants through cold veins. The rocket looked smaller than it did in training photos, and somehow more dangerous for that smallness. The young private who had been moving cables 2 hours earlier drifted near her station now, as if by accident. He kept his eyes on the floor. "Ma'am," he said, barely sound, "if you need a relay pulled." She shook her head once. "Not yet." He nodded, throat working, and moved on. T5. The security NCO lingered at the door, gaze steady, not unkind. His hand rested near the clasp of his gloves, the way a runner rests a toe on the line before the gun. He had heard the lieutenant. He had seen the phone. He had also watched Mira not raise her voice, not grandstand, not flinch. "Final call," the Major said. "All stations commit." Mira's screen blinked, not with color but with meaning. The microstutter danced, vanished, danced again. She imagined it in the air, a shiver in the long body as the vehicle drank acceleration. A tilt that wasn't a tilt, a correction that didn't need correcting until it did. She imagined its curve bending a handful of degrees and heard, behind the hum of electronics, the echo of another room years ago where she had been right too late. She drew a breath that reached the bottom of her ribs. In it lived dust and electricity and the taste of an old promise. "T2, guidance," the Major said. "Lock console. Eyes only until ignition." Her fingers hovered over the keys. She did not press them. Not yet. On the far wall, the numbers gleamed like they had been carved into glass. In the reflection on her monitor, she saw the captain's phone angle higher, that red dot blinking like a metronome, recording someone's idea of a joke. She saw the lieutenant's easy grin. She saw the private's thin shoulders square. She saw, in the corner of the glass, her own face set the way it set when someone told her to wait for permission from physics. T1. The door clicked. Soft boots on tile came and stopped behind her. The shadow between her and the light stretched an inch. "Ma'am," the security NCO said, quieter than before, "when the director calls it, I'll have to move you back from the console." Mira nodded once. Eyes on the stutter the board kept calling nominal. "I understand," she said. The clock rolled toward the last minute, and the room leaned with it, like a ship taking a long swell. No one laughed now. Even the phone seemed to hold its breath. Out beyond the glass the rocket waited, white against a sky so bright it hurt. Mira moved her right hand until it hung above the emergency menu she wasn't authorized to open. "Just in case," she whispered, to no one, to the machine, to the math. The second hand fell. The room tightened. The heat outside trembled. 0:30. The seconds bled away with the inevitability of tide. Every console glowed steady, technicians perched stiff in their chairs, each pair of eyes flicking between displays, and the countdown pulsing on the wall. Heat shimmered through the observation glass, tinting the missile with a mirage glow. Mira Kalin stayed at her station, hand hovering just short of the unauthorized menu. The air pressed heavy, humming with circuits, whispers, and the low tick of the timer. Then came ignition. The floor shuddered, a bass note rumble swelling until it filled every chest in the room. Fire clawed out from the launch platform, swallowing shadows on the desert floor. The long white shape leapt skyward in a bloom of smoke and light. Windows rattled, voices caught in throats, and then the vehicle was gone. Into the blue, dragging a tail of white that laced across the horizon. For a moment, applause tried to start, cut short by the silence that followed. Eyes swung to the trajectory plot blooming across screens. Dots aligned, green markers marched upward along a predicted path. Relief washed through the room like a shared breath. Someone chuckled nervously. Another murmured, "Looks good." But Mira's panel betrayed a different story. Numbers she had trained herself to read like weather shifts told her the curve bent ever so slightly. Not wild, not obvious, yet enough to matter. She whispered the figures under her breath, comparing the actual track with the calculated model. Each refresh showed a faint drift outward, accumulating grain by grain. "Director confirmed nominal flight," one controller announced loudly, eager to be first. "Nominal confirmed," came the reply. The room eased a fraction. Mira's pulse did not ease. She toggled another diagnostic, dragging up sensor deltas. The slip appeared like a ghost line, a pale shadow trailing the projected arc. It was not wide yet, but wide could grow. She reached for her comm again. Before she could speak, a firm hand landed on her shoulder. The security NCO from the doorway leaned close, voice low. "They want you away from the board. Orders from above. They'll lose control," she said, eyes never leaving the flickering numbers. "Ma'am," he muttered, "I'm just the messenger." Two more guards advanced from the wall, boots squeaking against polished tile. The lieutenant grinned across the aisle, enjoying the spectacle. The captain with the phone tilted the lens higher, capturing every twitch of her fingers. Mira's chair scraped as they tried to pull her back. She resisted, one palm slamming down onto the console edge. Trajectory deviating, she snapped. Magnitude still small, correction window open. The director swung toward her with visible irritation. "Engineer, you're out of line." Telemetry shows nominal. She spun her screen outward. Not telemetry summary, raw data. Look, a ripple of unease passed through the closest operators as they glanced at her graphs. The minor stutter she had warned about now etched faint sore teeth across the line. One young analyst swallowed hard, uncertain. But the major in charge waved a hand, unwilling to admit doubt in front of so many. "We proceed. Stand down." The guards tugged harder. Mira's chair screeched against tile, her nails dug into the console lip. Heat from the screens painted her face in ghostly green. Through the glass wall, the missile shrank as it clawed higher. Sunlight gilded its plume, dazzling enough to blind the careless. To most eyes it was beauty, to hers it was an omen. Her breath quickened. She calculated the vector again in her head. No calculator needed, muscle memory from a dozen simulations. The numbers sang the same discord. They would miss the target box if nothing changed. Not by miles, not yet, but enough to risk debris falling short of the safe zone. "Release her," the major ordered, exasperated. One guard hesitated. The NCO frowned, uncertain. Mira seized that sliver. She lunged, pressing a sequence with the heel of her hand. Alarms chirped as the console recognized an override attempt. The room erupted in shouts. "What are you doing?" the lieutenant barked. "She's tampering!" "Correction vector," Mira answered sharply. Her eyes darted across the inputs, fingers flying faster now, every keystroke a plea to physics to listen. The radar display twitched. A new marker traced across the main arc, a course-adjust line. For 3 breaths, chaos reigned. Controllers shouting. The director demanding lockdown, security reaching again for her arms. Then the projection stabilized. The ghost line merged closer to the green corridor, deviation narrowing. Mira sagged against her chair, sweat prickling down her spine. The private who had offered to help earlier let out a hiss of astonishment. She fixed it. Not everyone looked relieved. The major's face tightened, a man caught between gratitude and fury. He lifted his headset. "Range, confirm correction." A pause crackled. Then confirmed. Trajectory within acceptable parameters. The tension broke like glass. Operators sagged back, exhaling, but the director's eyes hardened. "Escort her out. She doesn't act again without authorization." Mira pushed hair from her face, meeting his stare. "Authorization won't stop gravity." The guards gripped her arms. This time, even the NCO did not intervene. They pulled her back from the console as murmurs rustled through the room, half in awe, half in judgment. Colonel Aldrich Briggs had entered quietly during the commotion, his boots soundless on the tile. Now his presence became known. Tall frame casting a shadow over the nearest station. His gaze swept the graphs, then stopped on Mira. She felt his eyes before she saw him. A weight pressed the air. She turned, and in that instant, her collar shifted. The small metal insignia, long hidden under fabric, caught the overhead light. Steel glinted. A symbol engraved with lines no one outside certain circles should recognize. The colonel's expression fractured. A man who had carried calm through decades of classified launches suddenly froze. His lips parted, words escaping almost against his will. That crest, "You're not supposed to have it." The room stilled, even louder than silence before. The lieutenant's smirk slid away, replaced by confusion. The captain lowered his phone, uncertain. Every operator stared, not at the screens anymore, but at Mira's collar. Her pulse thundered. She raised her chin, not in defiance, but in resignation. There was no hiding now. The colonel stepped closer, eyes locked on the badge. "Explain yourself." But she said nothing. The only sound was the fading roar of the missile overhead, echoing through the desert sky. The command center seemed to shrink around her as every gaze locked on that gleam at her collar. Conversations died mid-word. The rattle of keyboards stopped. Mira Kalin did not move, shoulders squared though her heartbeat drummed in her ears. The insignia had slipped free for less than a second, but that single flash of steel carried a weight heavier than the roar of the rocket still echoing across the desert. Colonel Aldrich Briggs stood utterly still, his features caught between disbelief and suspicion. He had the kind of presence that bent rooms, his silence louder than any reprimand. Slowly, deliberately, he circled toward her, his boots marking out a measured rhythm against the tile. "Who issued you that badge?" he asked at last, his voice low but cutting. Mira pressed her lips together. She had rehearsed 100 ways to deflect questions like this, but never in front of a room full of officers and analysts. A dozen memories pressed in, half-lit corridors, midnight projects buried beneath layers of clearance, the faces of colleagues who had vanished into rumor after one disastrous test. The lieutenant who had taunted her earlier shifted uneasily, his earlier smugness replaced with unease. "Sir? Maybe it's counterfeit," he muttered, as if needing the colonel to rescue him from the possibility that the technician he mocked was someone far more dangerous. But Briggs didn't look away. He bent slightly, enough to see the symbol more clearly, the etching of a winged crest around a hidden cipher. Counterfeit? No. I signed decommission orders myself. Only a handful were struck. "So how?" he asked, voice gaining force. "Does one end up on your uniform?" Mira's silence was answer enough. It was not defiance. It was the stillness of someone unwilling to lie, yet not free to speak truth. The director cleared his throat, eager to restore control. "Colonel, with respect, the test vehicle is still in flight. Perhaps this discussion can—" "Quiet," Briggs snapped, never taking his eyes off Mira. The rocket's trajectory continued on the main display, the path hugging close to the safe corridor she had forced into being. The correction had worked. Yet no one was celebrating. The room felt less like a success and more like a courtroom, and she, the accused. The colonel straightened, addressing the room. "Everyone here will treat what they just saw as classified. Not a word leaves this facility." His tone left no room for disagreement. Even the lieutenant dropped his gaze. Two guards still held Mira's arms. Briggs flicked his fingers. "Release her." They obeyed. She rubbed her wrists, then folded her hands neatly in front of her, as though determined to give them no spectacle. Briggs leaned close enough for only she could hear. "You shouldn't exist." Sentinel crest was dissolved. "If you're still standing here, someone lied to me." She finally spoke, softly. "Not lied. Forgotten." That single phrase seemed to shake him. "Forgotten." The colonel looked away, as if her words struck a part of him he thought buried. Before anyone could press further, a shrill alarm cut through the air. All eyes whipped back to the telemetry wall. A red streak of code scrolled upward. Unauthorized access detected. The young private blurted, "External intrusion!" The director barked for confirmation. A controller hammered keys, unknown source piggybacking through the telemetry relay. They're trying to rewrite guidance mid-flight. Chaos bloomed. Voices overlapped, orders tangled. The lieutenant swore under his breath. Someone shouted for range control. Mira leaned toward the nearest console, scanning the intrusion stream. It was elegant. Malicious code that disguised itself as routine packets, trickling into the missile's onboard brain. If it rooted deep enough, the vehicle could be stolen mid-air. She spoke quickly. "They're tunneling through the downlink handshake. If they overwrite the correction I pushed, the missile won't stay in corridor." The director snapped. "How do you know that?" Briggs answered for her, grim. Because she was one of the engineers who wrote the original handshake protocol. The room froze again. Then the private whispered, "Then she's the only one who can block it." Briggs met her eyes. "Kalen, stop them." For the first time, authority gave her what she needed, permission. She dropped into the chair, fingers slamming across keys. Screens filled with hex dumps and raw time codes. She typed without hesitation, eyes flicking in patterns too quick for anyone else to follow. The enemy stream shifted, adapting, trying to outpace her counter. The missile's trace wobbled on the wall, jerking away from the safe path, then back. Gasps swept the room. Mira's breath came short but steady. She unlocked a buried subroutine she had sworn never to touch again, an emergency command that forced the system into manual isolation. The interface resisted, warning of irreversible lockout. She pushed past. A second alarm screamed. If she failed, the missile would initiate self-destruct to prevent capture. Operators clutched their headsets, sweat on brows. Briggs stood immovable behind her chair, jaw set. Lines of code cascaded. Mira whispered the sequence under her breath like a prayer, pressing final keys. The feed stuttered, then snapped back. The hostile stream severed. On the big display, the missile's path steadied, sliding true once more. The room erupted in shouts, a mix of relief and awe. Some clapped shoulders, others simply stared. Mira leaned back, exhausted but upright. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled them from the console. Briggs spoke into the sudden hush. You all witnessed this. Without her, we would have lost control today. Understand what that means. His gaze swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. Then he turned to Mira. His voice dropped, roughened. You've been hiding in plain sight. That ends now. She looked at him, weary but unflinching. I didn't ask to be exposed. Nevertheless, Briggs replied, the world just saw proof. He nodded toward the captain's phone, still in hand, its lens dark but damning. And if that footage leaves this room, every shadow you tried to disappear into will be burned away. The captain paled, lowering the device entirely. Mira exhaled slowly. Then I'll have to finish what I started before someone else decides to finish it for me. Above them, the desert sky swallowed the missile's final roar. Inside the room, the weight of secrets pressed down harder than the heat outside. The rocket's thunder faded into memory, but the command center did not settle. Relief had washed through them when Mira severed the hostile stream, yet it curdled quickly into unease. Screens returned to calm green, but no one trusted them. Operators whispered to one another, cautious, as though afraid their own words might be logged. Colonel Briggs remained planted behind Mira, arms folded, his eyes unreadable. He had ordered her to act, and she had delivered. But the insignia on her collar lingered like a ghost in the room. No one dared mention it, yet everyone's thoughts circled back to that gleam of metal. The director tried to restore procedure. Range reports vehicle stable, continuing profile, he announced. His voice wavered, as though reading lines that no longer mattered. Mission designated successful pending re-entry. No, Briggs interrupted. His tone cut clean through the haze. This mission was compromised. Whoever penetrated our downlink did so with sophistication far beyond what we've prepared for. And she, he pointed at Mira without turning his head, was the only one who recognized it in time. The lieutenant shifted uneasily, muttering, "Sir, she acted without clearance. She saved the test," Briggs snapped. The words slammed across the room, leaving no space for contradiction. Mira sat straighter, though her face remained composed. She had no desire to gloat. Each success brought more attention, and attention was the last thing she wanted. Yet the silence that followed Briggs's defense pressed in heavier than condemnation. The colonel leaned down, voice pitched for her alone. "We're not finished here. You and I will talk, away from this crowd." She nodded once, accepting inevitability. The guards stepped forward at Briggs's gesture, not to restrain this time, but to escort. The lieutenant's disappointment was obvious. He had expected her removal in shame, not in guarded respect. They moved through the corridor that led away from the control floor, air cooler in the passage, yet weighted with echoes. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing their shadows long across the sterile walls. Mira's boots clicked against polished concrete. Briggs walked close, his presence sharp as the desert sun outside. Halfway down the hall he spoke. "That emblem, why do you still carry it?" Mira kept her gaze ahead. "Because forgetting it doesn't erase what was built under that banner." Briggs studied her profile. Sentinel Crest was terminated after Caldera. "I signed the burial myself. No survivors were listed." "I was never on the list," she answered, voice quiet but steady. "Someone needed a scapegoat. I was convenient." They reached a secure door. Briggs keyed it open himself, ushering her inside. The chamber beyond was smaller, lined with soundproofing panels, a conference room repurposed for secrecy. He closed the door with deliberate force. "Sit." She remained standing. "Ask, and I'll answer what I can." Briggs regarded her for a long time before speaking. "That incursion, was it coincidence, or were they aiming for you?" The question pierced deeper than she expected. Mira breathed slowly, collecting thoughts. The exploit they used was tailored for the original protocol. Few would know how to craft that stream unless they'd studied our architecture closely. That narrows suspects. Name them? I can't. Too many fragments of Crest ended up scattered. Pieces went private, others buried in archives. But whoever it is, they're resurfacing now. Briggs paced slowly around the table, hands clasped behind his back. "And you've been hiding here, among regular test crews, hoping no one would notice." "I wasn't hiding," she corrected. "I was working. Quietly. Because silence is safer than trying to prove what you know when no one wants to hear it." Briggs halted. "Until today, until your officers mocked the wrong person," she said without heat. The colonel's lips twitched, though not in humor. "You've made my situation difficult. If I shield you, I invite questions from higher command. If I expose you, I risk destroying the only chance to understand what's hunting us." Before she could reply, the intercom crackled. A controller's voice, panicked. "Colonel, intrusion renewed. They're not through the downlink this time. They're in our command net." Briggs yanked the door open. Mira followed at his heels. Back in the control room, chaos had blossomed again. Consoles flickered with static, error codes bleeding across once stable displays. Operators scrambled, slapping keys uselessly. The director shouted for system resets. The private near telemetry shouted louder, "They're overriding our own boards." Mira scanned the room once and knew the truth. This was no test of equipment. It was a direct assault on them. Someone outside wanted the facility blind, paralyzed. Briggs barked, "Isolate uplinks now." "It's spreading too fast," a technician cried. "Root process compromised. Move." Mira snapped, shoving past to the guidance console. Her hands flew across keys, pulling logs straight from memory buffers before the corruption swallowed them. The code smelled of Crest again, twisted, repurposed. Whoever was behind this had stolen fragments of her old team's work and weaponized them. She dug into the colonel, pushing commands at breakneck pace. Warnings screamed across her display. If she failed, the test range wouldn't simply lose the rocket. They could lose every connected node, every archive, every classified store in the facility. The director tried to drag her back. "She'll crash the network." Briggs shoved him aside with a glare. "Let her work." The intrusion surged like fire racing through dry grass. Mira slammed a final command, invoking a buried watchdog program she had written years ago as a safeguard. The entire room went black. Screens died. Lights flickered out. For 3 seconds, only heartbeats and frantic breathing filled the dark. Then, one by one, systems rebooted. Displays returned, this time clean. Error codes gone. Intrusion severed. Gasps and cheers burst out together. Some clutched each other, unable to believe they still had power. Others stared at Mira as though seeing someone both alien and essential. She straightened, drained but unwavering. "You're safe for now. But they'll try again. Stronger." The colonel stepped forward. His eyes reflected both pride and dread. "You just proved Sentinel Crest never really died. The question is, what else did you bring back with you?" Mira held his gaze, saying nothing. Around them, the room buzzed with confusion, but between her and Briggs stretched a silence heavy with recognition. At last, he spoke quietly. "From this moment, you're no longer background staff, you're part of my detail. And until I decide otherwise, no one outside this room knows the truth." Mira inclined her head. She had traded invisibility for exposure, anonymity for responsibility. The badge at her collar no longer hid in shadow. It blazed beneath the fluorescent lights like a challenge. And somewhere beyond Granite Flats, whoever had tried to seize their missile now knew exactly who had stood in their way. The aftershock of the blackout lingered long after the screens had blinked back to life. Operators moved with cautious urgency, speaking in clipped tones, afraid that even their voices might feed into some unseen breach. The air smelled faintly of ozone, like a storm had passed through wires. Colonel Briggs remained rooted at the center, his presence a steel anchor. Mira Kalin stood close, drawing sidelong looks from those who now knew she was not the anonymous technician they had once dismissed. The insignia at her collar caught the fluorescent light again, and though no one dared speak of it, the gleam reminded them of a truth they wished they could unsee. "Lock down the uplink trunks," Briggs ordered, his tone brooking no delay. "No relays left open, no wireless beyond this room. We rebuild from isolation." The director moved as if to protest, but thought better of it. Pride had no place now. He began shouting instructions down the line. Keys clattered, commands executed, firewalls raised like hastily thrown barricades. Mira leaned toward Briggs. That attack wasn't a probe. They knew exactly where to strike. He nodded grimly. "Which means they've had access before." The implication sent a ripple through her chest. If an adversary had infiltrated once, they might have been listening for months, years even. All the while, people inside had laughed at her caution. A young analyst approached, tablet trembling in his hands. "Sir, we recovered fragments of the hostile code before the reset. It's advanced, layered with signatures we don't recognize." He glanced nervously at Mira. "But some of the structure matches old defense research patterns." Her jaw tightened. Sentinel designs. Twisted, but ours. Whispers stirred around them. Briggs silenced them with a glare. "File it for classified review. Nothing leaves this floor." He lowered his voice toward Mira. "We'll need to speak where walls don't have ears." She followed him out into the corridor once more. The guards fell in behind them, wary but deferential now. They passed through sterile hallways, then up a stairwell where the sound of their boots echoed sharp against concrete. At the top, Briggs unlocked a smaller observation deck, glass windows framing the vast desert. The horizon shimmered, heat still rising from the tarmac below. The missile's contrail stretched pale and broken across the sky, a scar in blue. Briggs let the silence hang before he turned. "You weren't supposed to be alive." When Caldera collapsed, reports said no one walked out. Yet here you are. Why? Mira studied the desert line rather than his eyes. Because someone had to be left to remember. They chose me to bear the mistake, to vanish in place of those who couldn't face it. I was written off so they could close the books, and you carried the badge. "I carried the truth," she corrected softly. Briggs paced a slow line across the room. Do you understand what it means that the breach code carries Crest's fingerprints? Somewhere, someone is using our ghosts. Either a traitor survived, or pieces of our work were stolen and cultivated. Both are possible, Mira admitted. Fragments of Crest were scattered into too many hidden corners. I tried to track them once, gave up when no one listened. His gaze hardened. They'll listen now. She turned to him finally. And what will you tell them? That a program they buried has crawled back from the grave? That the scapegoat they threw away is the one plugging holes they created? The Colonel's expression remained stern but not unfeeling. I'll tell them the truth I saw with my own eyes, and I'll fight for what comes next. But make no mistake, you've painted a target on yourself. Mira gave a tired smile. That target was painted long ago. You're only seeing it now. The intercom in the wall crackled. Colonel, urgent range control reports attempted access on external comm arrays. We think they're mapping us. Briggs strode to the door. Stay here. Mira shook her head. If they're mapping, it's not passive. They'll strike again soon. He regarded her for a beat, then gestured her along. Fine. But understand, from here on you're visible. No more shadows. They descended back into the bustle. The facility thrummed with nervous energy, soldiers running cabling, technicians pulling plugs, analysts huddled over streams of data. It looked less like a test site now, and more like a fortress bracing for siege. As they entered, the lieutenant who had mocked her earlier snapped to attention, trying to mask his shaken pride. He muttered something about orders carried out, but Briggs ignored him. At telemetry, the private raised his hand. Sir, intrusion attempt routed through satellite bounce. Hard to trace, but origin isn't domestic. Whoever's behind this is masking deep, then they fear exposure as much as we do, Mira said. She studied the data lines, eyes narrowing. But fear makes them dangerous. They won't stop until they break us, or until they know we can break them back. Briggs issued new commands. Double security, scrub every system, isolate archives. Yet, as he spoke, Mira saw fatigue creeping into the faces around her. These were skilled operators, but they had not been trained to fight shadows. She had. She turned to Briggs. You can harden defenses, but they'll keep shifting attack vectors. You need someone who understands the bones of their code. He inclined his head. And you're volunteering. I don't need to volunteer, she answered. I already started. Hours bled into evening light. The desert outside glowed bronze, long shadows stretching from antenna towers. Inside, tension never eased. Each time an alert pinged, men flinched, expecting the next assault. Mira worked at the console, rewriting filters, building decoys, laying digital tripwires that might buy them minutes when the enemy struck again. At last, a voice called from comms. Colonel, unidentified, burst on long-range band. Could be a handshake. Everyone stiffened. Mira leaned forward. Put it on my panel. The data scrolled, jagged, half-coded. She recognized the cadence. It's them. They're taunting us. A string of characters appeared at the end of the burst, cryptic, but clear to her. You should have stayed buried. Gasps echoed. Briggs's eyes flicked to Mira. She exhaled slowly, almost a whisper. They know who I am. The colonel placed a heavy hand on the table. Then the fight just became personal. And this time, we're not waiting for them to choose the battlefield. Mira looked at the contrail fading into the dusk sky. Whatever enemy had reached for their systems wasn't finished. Neither was she. The insignia at her collar, once hidden, now felt less like a secret and more like a flag, one she hadn't chosen to raise, but one she could no longer lower. The taunting message still lingered on the screen when silence fell over the control room. No one moved. Even the hum of the servers seemed subdued, as if the machines themselves had registered the threat. Colonel Briggs's hand remained flat against the table, knuckles pale, his jaw taut. Mira Kalin stared at the characters that spelled out her exposure, feeling the weight of years crash down in a single phrase. "They don't just know our systems," she said finally. Her voice was low, steady, but it cut through the room like a blade. "They know me." Briggs turned, his gaze sharp. "Then they'll aim every strike at the weak points they believe you left behind." The lieutenant, emboldened by fear, muttered, "Maybe they're right. Maybe she's the reason they're in at all." Briggs's head snapped toward him. The reprimand was unspoken but lethal. The lieutenant swallowed his words. Mira didn't flinch. She had heard worse, and she had learned not to waste breath on proving innocence. "Colonel," said the director, voice clipped, "if this continues, the entire range will be compromised. We need higher authority." "No," Briggs cut in. "We'll contain this here. If Command learns the breach code carries Crest architecture, they'll shut us down before we trace it. We need evidence first." Mira folded her arms, weighing her next words. "Then we bait them. Let them think we're blind while we watch every step." Eyes swung toward her, half doubtful, half desperate. Briggs nodded once. "Show me how." She returned to her station, fingers brushing across the keyboard like a pianist poised at the opening note. "We build a decoy net. Give them false telemetry to chew on while we plant hooks to trace their path back." "Too risky," the director objected. "If they realize, they already know who I am," Mira said flatly. "There's no turning back." Preparations began at once. Technicians rerouted feeds under her instructions, creating phantom consoles that mirrored genuine systems but led nowhere. Mira coded swiftly, layering misdirection, weaving false trails like a hunter shaping snares. Operators around her watched in silence, the rhythm of her keystrokes unnerving in its precision. The sun slid lower, spilling amber light across the desert. The antenna towers outside stretched long shadows across the sand, and the facility lights hummed alive in anticipation of nightfall. Inside, the tension only deepened. At last, the private at telemetry spoke up. "Contact. They're back." The room braced. Red lines crawled across Mira's decoy network, probes darting like fingers through locks. She allowed them to spread, careful not to appear resistant. Each false node they touched planted a hidden tracer, a filament of code pointing back upstream. "Hold them steady," she whispered, though the words were for herself. "Come closer. Take the bait." For minutes, the center of the room was nothing but the glow of screens and the quickening breath of those who waited. Then, on Mira's secondary display, faint coordinates began to form, tiny echoes of origin bleeding through the enemy's camouflage. "I've got fragments," she announced. Not full location, but narrowing fast. Briggs leaned over her shoulder. "Where?" "Eastern Seaboard Relay," she answered, fingers darting. "Civilian infrastructure piggybacked. They're bouncing through foreign gateways, but the route trace..." She paused, eyes narrowing. "Closer than I thought. Too close." Before she could finish, the hostile code shifted violently. It surged down paths she hadn't anticipated, slamming against the decoys with raw force. Warnings screamed. "They've realized they're being tracked," Mira snapped. "They're trying to burn the trail." The decoy network lit up red, collapsing node by node. Sparks of code scattered like embers. Technicians cried out as screens flooded with errors. Mira's pulse hammered, but she pressed on, yanking what fragments she could before the trail vanished. Then, just as suddenly, everything stilled. The hostile stream cut off. Consoles returned to blank normalcy, eerie in their calm. The private exhaled shakily. Gone. Just gone. But Mira's display still glowed with a single captured coordinate. She stared at it, lips parting. Briggs caught her reaction. "What did you find?" Her throat tightened before she forced the words out. "The trail leads back to a facility once marked as abandoned. A crest-black site." A chill ran through the room. Everyone knew what it meant. Whoever was attacking them wasn't an outsider stealing scraps. It was someone who had lived inside the program, someone who had survived the purge just as she had. Mira looked at Briggs, her face stripped of any mask. "I wasn't the only one left." The colonel's silence was heavier than anger. At last he said, "Then we're not fighting ghosts, we're fighting our own." The revelation rippled through the command floor. The lieutenant stared pale-faced at the insignia on Mira's collar, as though seeing it anew. The captain with the phone put the device down entirely, no longer interested in mocking footage. Even the director bowed his head, unable to argue. Briggs broke the silence. "We lock down Granite Flats. No transmissions leave this site until we know the truth. And Mira," he looked at her with something almost like respect, though hard-edged, "you're coming with me when we confront this. You've seen their code. You understand their mind. I'll need that." She let the weight of his words settle. For years she had worked in the shadows, hiding the badge, burying the past. Now there was no turning away. "I'll go," she said, "but understand this. They know every trick I know. They built them with me." Briggs's eyes glinted. "Then it's time you built something new." The desert night pressed against the glass, deep blue streaked with the fading scar of contrail. Inside the command center, no one felt relief, only the tremor of a larger storm approaching. Mira adjusted the collar of her uniform, the badge gleaming in harsh light, no longer hidden but carried like both weapon and warning. The message had been clear: you should have stayed buried. But Mira Kalin knew there would be no more burying, not of her, not of Sentinel Crest, and certainly not of the truth clawing its way back from the shadows. The desert night pressed close to Granite Flats, a heavy silence stretching across the compound. Inside the command center, the hum of machines never ceased, yet every operator moved like someone aware of being watched. The enemy had gone quiet, but quiet only meant preparation. Colonel Briggs summoned Mira Kalin into a smaller operations chamber. The walls here bore no windows, only panels of matte steel. A map projection glowed across the table, marking communication relays, storage depots, and one flashing icon on the eastern seaboard, coordinates she had wrestled from the collapsing trail. Briggs tapped the point with a blunt finger. That site was listed as dismantled 8 years ago. If it's live again, it's not by accident. Mira studied the projection. The symbol on her collar caught the light, casting a faint reflection on the table. It was never dismantled. Crest projects were rarely ended. They were shelved, sealed, or hidden behind new names. If the breach came from there, it's someone who knows the framework from inside out. Briggs's expression remained granite. Then, we're dealing with a defector. Someone who walked away with more than just memory. They didn't walk, Mira said, voice steady. They were allowed. Or ordered. Her words sank into the room like lead. Briggs straightened, turning to the cluster of officers nearby. No transmissions about this leave Granite Flats. Anyone breaks silence, they answer to me. The director opened his mouth to argue, but faltered under Briggs's stare. The others lowered their eyes. Mira turned the map, zooming in. We won't trace them again if they know we're watching. Next time they'll bury their steps deeper. The only way forward is to draw them into a fight here. On ground we control. Briggs arched an eyebrow. You're suggesting baiting them? She nodded. They already tested our defenses. If we act weak, they'll come harder, expecting to finish what they started. That's when we turn it back on them. The colonel considered her, then finally said, set it up. The next hours unfolded in a blur of preparation. Engineers rerouted circuits into sacrificial loops, decoys layered deeper than before, false telemetry programmed to look like legitimate flaws. Mira orchestrated it with the precision of someone building a snare for a predator she had studied all her life. The private shadowed her, quick to follow instructions, his earlier awe settling into determination. Even the lieutenant who had mocked her kept silent now, forced into uneasy respect. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling fences and sending grit against the walls. Inside, every person braced for the return strike. It came just past midnight. The alarms erupted in unison, scarlet lights pulsing across the room. Consoles screamed with incoming streams. This time the attack came like a hammer. No subtle infiltration, but a flood meant to overwhelm. Red across every panel, data bursts battering at their firewalls. They're coming through everything at once, an operator shouted. Hold them on the decoys, Mira commanded, her hands already flying over the console. Don't resist too hard, let them think we're crumbling. The fake systems absorbed the strike, collapsing node by node. Sparks of code twisted into chaos across displays. Technicians swore under their breath as familiar readouts burned away. To the enemy, it would look like total collapse. Then Mira sprang the trap. With a keystroke, the buried hooks she'd planted activated, wrapping around the hostile streams. Each tracer clamped down like iron teeth, ripping at the cloaked origins. The enemy tried to recoil, to cut off, but momentum betrayed them. For the first time their path opened wider. I've got them, she breathed. Hold steady, don't sever yet. Lines of data poured onto her screen, coordinates bleeding through camouflage. She forced her will into the machine, overriding safety prompts, ignoring the warnings of instability. The trace drew back across continents, across hidden relays. And then the coordinates snapped clear. The projection lit up, a black site buried beneath the name of a research facility, nowhere near abandoned. Mira froze. She recognized the designation, not just Crest's work, her work, a sub-project she had designed in secrecy years before Caldera, never meant to survive. Yet here it was, alive and feeding the enemy. Her breath caught. They're using something I built. Briggs leaned close, eyes narrowing at the revelation. Then they know how you think. Every move you'd make, they'll anticipate. Unless I stop thinking the way they expect, Mira replied, voice edged with fire. Before she could drive deeper, the enemy realized their mistake. The hostile stream convulsed, pouring raw power into the network, desperate to break free. Consoles flickered, sparks spitting from one panel. A technician yelped as smoke hissed upward. "They're trying to fry us out," someone shouted. Mira's fingers blurred. One more second. Just one. She ripped the final packets from the stream, then severed connection herself. The displays snapped back to clean static. The attack was gone. The room erupted in noise, relief, disbelief, fear. Briggs silenced them with a barked order. Mira sat back, hair damp at the temples, heart still pounding. On her screen the coordinates glowed like a wound. She could not look away. Briggs placed a hand on the table, voice iron. "We have proof now." And we have a location. The private spoke, voice hushed. What happens next? The colonel's eyes swept the room, then landed on Mira. Next, we stop hiding. We confront them head on. Mira knew what that meant. Exposure, risk, stepping fully into the open where the enemy wanted her. Yet she also knew there was no other path. Every shadow she had lived in had been burned away. She rose, meeting Briggs's stare. Then we go to them. The colonel nodded once. And when we do, I expect you to finish what they started years ago, for good. The badge at her collar gleamed beneath the harsh lights, no longer hidden but burning like a brand. Around her, the operators stared in silence, each of them aware they had witnessed something they would never speak of again. The storm had broken. The real battle was no longer about a single missile test, or even Granite Flats. It was about ghosts given flesh, about the past refusing to die, and Mira Kalin, whether she wished it or not, stood at the center of it. Night had settled thick over Granite Flats, the desert beyond the wire shimmering faintly under a rising moon. Inside the compound, no one thought of sleep. The control center hummed at full alert, lights harsh against drawn faces. Operators hunched over terminals, some checking filters, others scrubbing the last fragments of hostile code. It looked less like a test range now, and more like a war room waiting for the next strike. Mira Kalin remained at her console, though her work was different from the others. While technicians patched firewalls and engineers replaced scorched panels, she pieced through the trail she had ripped from the enemy. Her screen showed coordinates blinking in quiet defiance, each one linked to a facility she had once believed gone. The glow on her face revealed little, but her mind churned. Every line of code she reviewed whispered reminders of buried projects she had thought never to see again. Colonel Briggs approached, steps heavy but measured. He stood behind her chair without speaking, watching the scrolling strings she manipulated. Finally, his voice broke the tension. "How certain are you that site is active?" Mira leaned back, weary but sharp. The code didn't just originate there. It carried modules only that location ever tested. Whoever's running it isn't copying from scraps. They have access to the full library. Briggs exhaled through his nose, gaze fixed on the glowing map. Then it's not an intruder scavenging old bones. It's Crest, alive in another skin. The lieutenant lingered nearby, uneasy. He wanted to argue but dared not after the last hours had shredded his certainty. Instead, he said tightly, "If we know where they are, why not strike now? Call in command, bring the hammer down." Mira swiveled toward him. "Because whoever's there expects that. They'd vanish before a plane reached the coast, or worse, they'd trigger what they've prepared. You saw how fast they reacted when I traced them." Her words cut through the room, silencing the scattered whispers. Even the lieutenant had no retort. Briggs studied her, expression unreadable. "Then what's your plan?" She hesitated. All eyes leaned her way. The badge on her collar glinted faintly, reminding everyone she was no longer the background figure they'd once ignored. "We don't hit them from above, we walk in." Gasps rose. A technician muttered, "That's suicide." Mira's tone was calm. "They know me. They built the taunt for me. If I show up in their systems directly, they'll engage. And when they engage, we pull everything. Names, structures, whatever they're hiding." The colonel's jaw tightened. "You mean to bait them with yourself?" "I'm already the target," she replied. "Better to use that than wait for them to pick the next time and place." For a long moment, only the whir of fans filled the room. Then Briggs gave a short nod. "Prepare it. But if you step into their net, you won't step alone." We do this under my command. The next hours were consumed in fevered work. Engineers carved out a clean system isolated from the rest of the range. A sterile chamber of wires and processors shielded against contagion. Soldiers dragged in portable generators, sealing the room like a bunker. It was a digital battlefield being built from scratch, designed for one purpose: confrontation. Mira oversaw every line, her hands never still. She coded tripwires, loops and choke points, blending tricks no manual would ever list. The private assisted, eyes wide but quick, following her directions without pause. Across the room, Briggs stood like a sentinel, watching the transformation. The director sulked at the margin, powerless now that his authority had slipped. When the chamber was ready, Mira sat before the sterile console. The hum of the generator filled the silence, a heartbeat of machinery. She flexed her fingers once, inhaling. For years she had avoided this exact moment. Direct contact with ghosts of her past. Now there was no choice. Briggs rested a hand on the back of her chair. You have one mission. Force them to reveal themselves. The moment we have confirmation, we cut the line. She looked up at him, expression unreadable. And if cutting isn't possible, then you improvise. You've proven you can. Her lips curved faintly, not in humor but in recognition. Then she turned back to the console and initiated the handshake. The screens flickered, then filled with static. A heartbeat later, a cascade of characters poured across. They were waiting. "Welcome home," the message read. The operators behind her muttered. The words weren't aimed at the facility. They were for her. Mira typed swiftly, "Identify yourself." The reply came at once, "We are the ones who remembered what you forgot." She felt the air in the chamber thicken. Her pulse hammered, but she forced herself steady. "They're not masking this time," she told Briggs. "They want me to know it's them." The enemy began unleashing patterns, hurling cascades of code designed to overwhelm. Mira countered, fingers blurring. Every line of their assault carried fingerprints of techniques she had written long ago, twisted into new forms. Each keystroke was like dueling with her younger self, a reflection she could barely recognize. Briggs barked orders to his men to stand ready, but this fight was invisible to them. Only Mira saw the battlefield. Towers of logic gates toppling under pressure, walls of data slamming against decoys, counterattacks weaving like knives in the dark. "They're pushing harder," the private warned, staring at graphs spiking red. "They're testing me," Mira said, teeth clenched. She pushed back with a new command, one she had invented only that night, something Crest could never predict. The stream buckled, the enemy momentarily stunned. Her screen flared with a new line. "So you learned to change. Good. That means you're still ours." The words sliced colder than the night air. She stared at them, then struck back with a command that slammed the channel shut. The room erupted in warning sirens. Sparks hissed from a router stack. But then, through the smoke, the enemy's final signature appeared on a screen. Coordinates burned into the log before the stream died. Mira sagged against the chair, lungs heaving. She had forced them to reveal another layer of themselves, but at cost. The system was scorched, smoking from overload. Briggs gripped her shoulder. "You did it!" She shook her head. "We forced them to show a piece, not the whole." "Where?" Her eyes met his. "Not far from where Crest began. They've built a citadel from the ashes." The operators crowded closer, stunned. The private whispered, "Then it's real. They're alive." Briggs straightened, his voice hard. "Then that's where we go next." The badge at Mira's collar glinted in the bunker light, no longer a secret, but a declaration. She had walked willingly into the fire, and the fire had answered her name. Now there was no returning to shadows. The battlefield had been chosen, and the ghosts of Sentinel Crest were waiting. The coordinates burned in Mira Kalen's mind long after the last flicker of code had vanished from the console. Around her, technicians scrambled to replace scorched boards, the smell of singed wiring clinging to the chamber. The colonel had dismissed most of the operators, leaving only a skeleton crew. Granite flats felt hollow, like the breath had been drawn from its walls. Briggs stood near the observation glass, arms folded, his silhouette harsh against the desert moon. "They wanted you to see that location," he said at last. "They weren't careless. It was an invitation." Mira rose slowly, rolling stiffness from her shoulders. "Not an invitation, a challenge. They're daring us to come to them because they think we won't." The colonel turned, eyes narrowing. "But you will," she gave a faint nod. There was no denying it now. Every strike, every whisper from the network had been aimed at her. Whoever commanded that black site wanted her drawn into the open, perhaps to capture, perhaps to recruit, or perhaps to end what had been left unfinished years ago. The lieutenant, who had lingered near the door in silence, finally spoke. "Sir, if we even consider going to that place, we need authorization from higher command. Moving on a black site without clearance is treason." Briggs's response was a bark of bitter laughter. "Authorization? You think the same bureaucracy that buried Crest will give permission to uncover it again? If we wait, they'll erase every trace before daylight." Mira watched the exchange with detached calm. "He's right about one thing. The moment we move, the weight of secrecy becomes heavier than the enemy itself. We won't just fight them, we'll fight the silence our own people impose." Briggs faced her. "Then we do it quiet. We take a team small enough to slip beneath the radar, strike fast, and bring back proof that can't be buried." The private standing near the back swallowed audibly. "And if the proof doesn't come back?" "Then at least command will know it was real," Briggs said. Preparations began before dawn. A handful of chosen soldiers packed light gear, their faces grim as they loaded crates into a transport plane. Mira walked among them, checking equipment with the same care she had once used to test circuitry. She no longer looked like a background engineer. Her presence was as direct as the weapons they carried. The badge at her collar was visible now, unhidden, and none dared ask her to tuck it away. The journey eastward was silent. Engines droned over empty desert, then over the darker patchwork of forests and coastline. Inside the cabin, soldiers sat with helmets resting in their laps, eyes closed but minds awake. Briggs occupied the forward bench, silent as stone. Mira sat opposite, gaze fixed on the small monitor displaying the coordinates she had pulled. The longer she stared, the more it felt like looking at an old scar, one she had never expected to reopen. When the plane descended, dawn had only just broken. Mist clung to the coastline, curling through skeletal trees and half-collapsed warehouses. The black site rose from the fog not as ruins, but as a fortress cleverly disguised as decay. Barbed fencing ringed the perimeter, watchtowers standing like sentinels. To the untrained eye it looked deserted. Mira knew better. They moved through the tree line, boots sinking into damp earth. The air smelled of salt and rust. Briggs raised his hand, signaling halt as they neared a ridge overlooking the compound. Through binoculars they saw faint movement, patrols disguised as scavengers, rifles carried like tools. The deception was meticulous. "This place was never abandoned," Briggs murmured. Mira adjusted her focus. noting the antenna arrays disguised as broken scaffolding. They've been operating here in plain sight, hiding behind neglect. The lieutenant whispered, "How do we get in?" "Through the cracks they think no one remembers," Mira said. She pointed to a service tunnel partly collapsed near the shoreline. "That was built for coolant lines. I designed part of it myself. They'll assume time buried it, but if we're careful, it'll take us inside." Briggs studied her face. "You lead." The tunnel mouth gaped wide, choked with debris and moss. Soldiers moved stones aside, creating a narrow passage. Darkness swallowed them as they slid into the earth, flashlights cutting thin beams through dust. The air grew cooler, tinged with iron and mold. Every step echoed, a reminder that the structure was still alive beneath its skin. Halfway through, Mira paused, fingers tracing a section of wall, symbols etched faintly in the metal, long since worn. She remembered carving them during the construction years ago, identifiers only her unit understood. A code of belonging. Now, seeing them again, she felt a tremor in her chest. "They'll know someone came through here," she whispered. Briggs's voice rumbled softly behind her. "Then let's make it count." The tunnel opened into a maintenance bay lit dimly by overhead fluorescence. The group fanned out, rifles raised. Dust lay thick on machinery, but the consoles glowed faintly, indicators blinking. Not abandoned, never. Suddenly a voice echoed through hidden speakers, clear and mocking. "We wondered when you'd stop hiding." The soldiers froze. Mira lifted her head, scanning the ceiling. "Show yourself!" Laughter rolled, disembodied. "Why rush? You've already stepped back into the fold." Briggs motioned for silence, but Mira spoke again, her voice ringing steady. "You're not Crest. You're what's left after it was twisted." The voice answered smoothly, "No, Mira. We are Crest without chains. We kept building when the cowards tore down, and you were meant to lead us." The weight of those words struck her harder than she expected. Old memories of late-night labs, designs drafted under secrecy, colleagues whispering theories that no one else dared imagine. She had believed all of that died in Caldera. Now it returned like a spectre. "They'll try to break you," Briggs warned quietly, eyes locked on the shadows. Mira stepped forward, ignoring the rifles raised in protection. "If you think dragging the past from the grave will make me follow, you're wrong. I saw what Crest became. That's why I walked into obscurity instead of carrying its stain." A hiss of static answered, then the voice again. "You didn't walk away. You were pushed, branded, discarded, forced to vanish. We gave you a badge because we believed you, and you still wear it." She touched the collar unconsciously. The metal seemed heavier than ever. From the far wall, a panel slid open. Figures emerged, clad in uniforms without insignia, their faces obscured by masks. Rifles gleamed under the pale lights. Behind them stood a taller silhouette, the source of the voice now revealed in flesh. Mira's breath hitched, not in fear, but in recognition. The stance, the cadence of his step. A man she once worked beside, presumed dead. "Commander Rilan," she whispered. The figure inclined his head. "You remember?" Briggs raised his weapon, soldiers following. But Rilan only lifted a hand, calm, confident. "No need for guns. If we wanted you dead, you'd never have reached this chamber. We wanted you here because you're the missing piece." Mira steadied herself. "You're leading this." "I'm continuing what they buried," Rilan replied, his voice both familiar and foreign. Crest was never about protecting nations. It was about power beyond borders. We were betrayed, Mira. But together we can finish what we started, the colonel's voice thundered. "You hijacked our systems, Tried to steal a weapon mid-flight, and you call that continuation? Raylan ignored him, eyes fixed on Mira. They used you, framed you, discarded you, but I remember you were the brightest mind we had. That badge isn't a relic, it's proof you belong to us. The room hung thick with tension, soldiers' fingers twitching on triggers. Mira felt the weight of two worlds pressing down, one she had fled and one she now served. Her reply came like steel. I belong to no one. Not Crest, not you. Raylan's eyes glinted behind the mask. Then you choose to be their pawn again. And that, Mira, will make you my enemy. The lights above flickered, and every console in the bay surged alive. Alarms blared, mechanical doors slamming shut. Soldiers swung their rifles, but Raylan and his masked followers melted back into corridors as quickly as they had appeared. Briggs shouted, "Defensive positions!" Mira scanned the consoles as new streams of code unfurled. They weren't just trapped. They were being tested again, here in the heart of the enemy's citadel. For the first time since Granite Flats, Mira felt the line drawn sharp. Not just between past and present, but between who she had been and who she must become. She tightened her fists. Whatever ghosts still lingered in this place, she would face them, not as a shadow of Crest, but as the only one willing to end it. The compound still reverberated with alarms when the transport finally lifted them away. Engines roared against the coastal wind, carrying Mira Kalen and the small strike team back into the sky. No one spoke. The men sat stiff in their seats, weapons still clutched like anchors, their eyes heavy with questions they dared not ask aloud. Colonel Briggs kept his gaze fixed forward, jaw like carved stone. He had seen the enemy's face, had heard the name Mira whispered with reverence and venom alike. The truth of Sentinel Crest was no longer rumor. It lived, and it had chosen its battlefield. Mira sat apart, collar slightly torn, badge gleaming faint under the cabin's dim light. She traced it once with her thumb, not as someone proud, but as someone burdened. The voice of Raylan still echoed in her head, tempting, condemning, daring her to choose. She had answered him, but the weight of that choice would follow her long after the night ended. The storm was no longer hidden. Crest's shadow had stepped into daylight, and Mira knew this was only the beginning. Whatever lay ahead would not be fought with code alone, nor with rifles in narrow corridors. It would be fought in every place power feared truth. As the coastline vanished beneath the clouds, Mira closed her eyes briefly. She was tired, but resolve burned brighter than exhaustion. The badge at her collar no longer felt like a relic. It was a vow. The fight was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The fight was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these untold battles alive. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you stood in Mira's place? Stay tuned for the next chapter and stand with us as veteran biker continues to reveal the truths hidden in the shadows.